My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. He's a former federal prosecutor. He's also a contributing editor at National Review Online, where he also is a frequent columnist, and he is a Fox News Channel contributor. We want to get his thoughts on a couple of critical stories today. First of all, the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, telling lawmakers this week that he is investigating how the investigation into alleged Trump-Russian collusion got started in the summer of 2016. We also want to get his reaction to the arrest of Julian Assange, who could soon be facing charges in the United States as well. So, Andy, busy day. Thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Greg. Sure is busy.
Well, it was yesterday. It was Wednesday up on Capitol Hill, where Bill Barr was testifying supposedly about his budget for the coming year at the Justice Department and the Senate Appropriations Committee. Not a lot of questions about that, as it turned out. He was asked about when the Mueller report's going to come out and how much of it would be redacted and that sort of thing. And then he also expanded onto the fact that he is looking into how the relevant agencies, whether intelligence or even FBI and Justice, decided to move forward with investigating the Trump campaign and whether it was colluding or conspiring in any way with the Russians during that campaign season. And he said there was spying, but it's quite possible there was an adequate predicate for it. But the word spying definitely set off a lot of alarm bells for Democrats. They are more skeptical of him than ever, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But based on what he said and what you've read, what will this investigation look like? How big and wide-ranging will it be?
Well, it really depends, Greg, on what's been done already. You know, I think that Attorney General Barr has been in for about a month now, I guess. And among the things that he needed to get his brain wrapped around once he was in office and read into all the classified information, et cetera, that he couldn't be read into before he was confirmed, he's got to look at the Inspector General investigation, which is looking at the Trump-Russia investigation. There was an assignment that was made by Attorney General Sessions in 2017 to John Huber, who is the U.S. Attorney of Utah, who was also assigned as a prosecutor to look into aspects of the investigation. So I imagine part of what has to happen is he needed to understand how far along those investigations are, what's been done on them. One of the interesting things he said in his testimony that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, probably because he said so much else, was that the IG investigation by Inspector General Horowitz will be released by June and maybe even by May. So that'll tell us a lot. But how much there remains to be done really is a function of how wide the mandate the IG and Mr. Huber understood that they had and what they've done up to this point. And that's hard to say.
Andy, one of the things you've been saying in our conversations for a long time, really ever since the Mueller investigation got going, and certainly as we learn more about it, was that those who expect massive revelations and swinging indictments against the President of the United States and the entire executive branch crumbling down, or at least the Trump administration crumbling down, we're probably going to be disappointed. And based on what we know from the Mueller report, that certainly seems to be the case. So now you've got some folks on the other side suggesting, okay, the dominoes are about to fall from Obama all the way down to Strzok and Page here. What sort of expectations would you encourage them to set here?
Low expectations. And I actually think, Greg, that's really appropriate. And I say this as, number one, take this with what grain of salt you will. I like a number of the people who were involved in this, and it's been hard for me, it continues to be hard for me to try to evaluate this, knowing that I know some of these people personally. I know Jim Comey going back 30 years. So understandably, I think I don't want to see anything awful like that happen to people. So take that for what it's worth. But I also think that there's two objectives here that people talk about, and one of them is a lot more important for the country than the other one. The main objective, it seems to me, is we need a complete record with total accountability of what happened here so that we can understand if this was caused by terrible judgment if assuming the worst for argument's sake, was it caused by terrible judgment by the people who were involved, or is there contribution from the fact that our laws are somehow inadequate or our procedures are inadequate? I mean, it seems to me that there are, for example, norms against political spying, and it's always been understood. It was certainly understood, I think, when I was at the Justice Department, those many years ago, that it wasn't that you could never engage in political spying, but you would not be able to do something like that unless it was a very serious offense. Now, and there was colorable evidence that it had been committed. There's nothing that I can recall in the way of regulations that says that. It's the sort of thing that was enforced by, adult leadership at the Justice Department and at the FBI. And, I think one of the things we have to find out here is, what was the predicate for the investigation? And one of the things I've found disturbing is that it seems to me that at each stage along the way, when there may have been a less intrusive investigative tactic that they could have used, like, if you've interviewed Carter Page 100 times over the years, why do you need to get a surveillance warrant on him? If you're interested in knowing what went on when he was in Russia, why don't you bring him in and interview him? And in fact, they're supposed to make a representation when they're seeking a warrant to explain, why they need a warrant and why less intrusive investigative means wouldn't be adequate. So I'd be interested to know what they said about that. But one of the disturbing things here is it looks like whenever they had a choice to make, they always pushed the envelope. They always took the more aggressive course. And sometimes you do that because you're dealing with something very serious, and sometimes you do it because you're wrong. And I think we need to find that out. But I guess the point I was starting to make, and I should have finished, is if you're going to make this about trying to prosecute people, trying to get enough evidence that you indict them, you're probably never going to indict people on this. Number one, a lot of things that are in the way of abuse of power are not indictable offenses. But number two, you've just raised the price tag on what I think is the more important thing, which is finding out what happened. And I think it's really important that we have to find out what happened here. If it's personnel driven, that's one thing. But if we have holes in our laws and our procedures, we need to address that.
We're talking with Andy McCarthy. And Andy, I just want to get your reaction real quick before we start talking about Julian Assange to the reaction of a lot of Democrats to Bill Barr's comments yesterday. Is it just a matter of him using the word spying and the connotation that has? Because we know, based on what you just said about FISA warrants, that there was surveillance on different people associated with the Trump campaign. So the idea that there was government surveillance going on shouldn't be shocking to anybody. That's a matter of public record now. So how do you read the reaction that we saw yesterday?
Hysterical. I really feel, Greg, like we're back in the stupidity of, I looked this up this morning, it was May of 2018, last year, when we learned about the Stefan Halper business and the fact that they had used, not only had they gotten surveillance warrants on Page, they had used an asset or an informant. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings by calling him a spy, to do surveillance. I don't mean to laugh, but I just, 11 months ago, there was it would have been incredible to say that there was no spying, and the debate had moved from whether that had happened or not to whether it was adequately predicated, and also whether it was directed at Trump as opposed to Trump's campaign, as opposed to like a few bad apples who were sort of in the orbit of Trump's campaign. But once all that information came out, nobody could credibly say there was no spying. And if what you object to is the word spying, I hate to hurt anybody's tender sensibilities with these awful words, but I must say a lot of the people who are whipped up are pretty guilty of some hot rhetoric on the other days of the week, even though they don't like the word spying on Wednesday, I guess. But I, as a prosecutor for 20 years, in my cases, the government informants were always called spies by the defense lawyers, and we always called them informants. And, they always called them snitches, and we always called them witnesses for the state, and nobody in the jury fainted when any of these terms we used, and they just kind of, we play out what the facts were. There was surveillance here. There were informants here who were running people. I mean, those are spying tactics. If you object to the word spy, I'm sorry. But, if you hang around Washington long enough, like for about 5 minutes, you're going to hear a lot worse.
All right, let's move on to Julian Assange now. 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy there in London. That ran out on Thursday. He was taken into custody for bail jumping due to charges that have since been dropped in Sweden for sexual assault. That'll happen, the bail jumping anyway, happened in 2012. That's why he ended up in the embassy of Ecuador there in London. But the bigger charge that could end up having him extradited to the United States is due to his effort to publish the classified information that he got, at least in part, from Bradley, now Chelsea Manning. So what do you make of this significant development? Will it actually come to pass that Assange comes to the U.S. and faces these charges finally?
Well, I've been looking at this hard for the last couple of hours, and especially the statute of limitations the last few minutes before we got together to talk. And I'll tell you right now, Greg, I'm going to be surprised if Julian Assange ever ends up in an American courtroom on this charge. And I don't know that I would have said that this morning when I first looked at it. But one of the things that I found curious is, to give a little background here, he's charged with a conspiracy to commit computer fraud. And that is the incident that occurred with Manning back in 2010. So the conspiracy was essentially over in May of 2010. He was indicted under seal in 2018, and I think it was March of 2018. So it's 8 years they waited to indict him. Now, the statute of limitations for conspiracy and for computer fraud and most federal crimes is 5 years. And it looks to me like the exception that they're relying on is if you have a computer fraud offense that it gets committed within the context of a crime of terrorism, you can extend the statute of limitations to 8 years. So what you were basically saying here is, before this ever gets to an American court, they're going to have to convince a British judge that this is a live case under the statute of limitations. And that, we're going to have to see if the Brits want to make their own evaluation of that, or, if they're going to rely on an American ruling. But I think that's they're really, talk about pushing the envelope. They're pushing the envelope with this. And I say this as someone who is, I try to be clinical about legal stuff. I can't stand Assange. I think he gets what he deserves. He's done terrible harm to the United States. I think they're going to have an uphill battle trying to show that this computer fraud offense was a terrorism offense.
Lastly on this, I don't know where the evidence exactly leads as to whether WikiLeaks was believed to be responsible for the hacking of the Podesta, the DNC emails, or whether it somehow just acquired them and disseminated that information. But is there any likelihood that he'd face charges for that scenario?
I would say, Greg, that if they have charges on him, like live charges, they should have tried to bundle everything together in one indictment, because they need to convince a judge overseas to extradite him. They need to convince a foreign government to extradite him. So anything that they had in the way of live charges that they thought they had enough evidence for, you would think that they would have brought that. And if they were hell-bent on getting him here, and they had something other than a very shaky, potentially stale computer fraud conspiracy offense, I think they would have charged it.
So it's possible we could be dealing with this guy for a while yet, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. Well, even in the best of things, Greg, I was involved in the terrorism litigation involving the U.S. embassy bombings in East Africa in 2000. And we had a British extradition proceeding in connection with that investigation. It took well over a year to get that resolved. And that's in a case that actually did undeniably involve terrorism and a person that you would think the Brits would have been delighted to get rid of. And yet, it's such a laborious process, extradition, that it took a very long time to get through it.
So this victory has not yet been achieved, but perhaps a step in that direction after so many years of him having shelter in the embassy. Andy, as we said, a very busy day, lots of different twists and turns that both of these stories could go down yet. So thank you very much for helping us understand them better.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Andy McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor. He is a contributing editor at National Review Online, where he's also a columnist, and he's a contributor for the Fox News Channel. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.